There are doors in old cities that no longer make sense. They sit half swallowed by pavement, their thresholds cut off at the knees. Windows begin where cellars should be. Granite steps descend to nowhere. In some streets, the ornate front entrance of a 19th century bank now opens below the sidewalk, as if the building has slowly sunk in shame. In others, a row of cast-iron storefronts seems to wear the city like a tide mark. Most people pass these details without stopping. They assume the building settled, or the road was repaved, or the architects made some strange, old-fashioned choice. The official explanations are usually small, local, practical, and sometimes they are true. But when the same odd mismatch appears again and again in Chicago, Seattle, Sacramento, Paris, Lower Manhattan, and the buried edges of San Francisco, it begins to look less like coincidence and more like a pattern, a forgotten one, a pattern in which the most important line in the city was not the skyline, but the ground. Because the ground, it turns out, was never fixed. Streets were raised, cut through, widened, buried, paved over, and politically redrawn. What the maps preserved was often the authority of a city. What the buildings preserved was its memory. And those two things do not always agree. If you want to understand why old buildings no longer match the maps, you have to begin with an uncomfortable thought. Cities are not simply built. They are edited. The modern map teaches us to imagine a city as stable. Streets have names, blocks have edges, addresses line up, entrances face the public way. Everything appears settled. But the old city was not settled at all. It was muddy, flood-prone, combustible, unsoured, politically volatile, and in many places physically unfinished. Its streets were often not streets in the way we understand them now. They were provisional surfaces of plank, packed dirt, cinders, drainage channels, and layered debris subject to weather, commerce, engineering, and panic. The building might be stone. The street was negotiable. That is why one of the most revealing archives in urban history is not the grand panoramic map or the commemorative engraving. It is the practical record, the survey, the sewer plan, the insurance map, the grade ordinance, the engineer's note about elevation and drainage. Those documents speak in a colder language, but they reveal what cities were really doing to themselves. They show stairways where none exist now, entrances at levels that seem absurd today, hollow sidewalks, retaining walls, old lot lines left stranded behind a newer curb. They show that the map was not a neutral image of reality. It was an instrument for making a new reality official. And often, that new reality was built directly over the old one. Chicago understood this early because Chicago had no choice. In the middle of the 19th century, the city sat low, flat, and damp, built on clay and loam with almost no natural drainage. Rainwater lingered, waste lingered, illness lingered. The city needed sewers, but sewers need fall, and Chicago did not have enough of it. So in the 1850s, under plans associated with the Board of Sewerage Commissioners and engineer Ellis Sylvester Chesbrough, the city began to do something extraordinary. It raised itself, not metaphorically, physically, across large sections of Chicago. Streets were elevated by 4, 5, sometimes 8 feet. Buildings had to follow or be left stranded below grade. Property owners lifted hotels, stores, banks, whole blocks of masonry, using jacks and crews of laborers in one of the strangest engineering episodes in American urban history. Tourists came to watch. Newspapers treated it as spectacle. But for residents, it was less a marvel than a necessity. The old street level had become incompatible with the new city the authorities wanted to build, and so one city was placed on top of another. That is the first reveal in this story. Old buildings do not always mismatch the map because the map is wrong. They mismatch it because the map often belongs to a different vertical city than the one still embedded in the structure. A doorway can be historically correct and topographically obsolete. A window can look like a basement window only because the street around it was lifted after the wall was built. But Chicago was not alone, and that matters, because one extraordinary case can be dismissed as a local solution. A pattern across multiple cities becomes something more revealing, a hidden chapter in the history of modernization itself. Sacramento offers a darker version of the same truth. Before the 1860s, the city stood lower than it does now and paid heavily for it. Floodwaters entered the streets so often that daily life became a negotiation with mud, timber, and fear. Then came the catastrophic floods of the 19th century, especially the Great Flood of 1862, and the argument was over. If the river would not respect the town would have to move upward. Owners of 2-, 3-, and 4-story buildings abandoned their ground floors. Sidewalks were rebuilt at the level of what had once been the first floor. Roads were raised to meet them. The old entrances went dark. In preserved corners of old Sacramento today, you can still stand at the lower courtyard and see what used to be the original street level. It is only about 10 feet below the modern one, which somehow makes it more haunting. Not deep enough to feel ancient, just deep enough to feel denied. The emotional power of places like that comes from their nearness. This is not the buried world of Rome or an excavation from classical antiquity. It is yesterday's street, hidden in plain sight. You do not need centuries of myth to reach it. You need a stare. And if Sacramento teaches us that cities buried old levels to survive water, Seattle teaches something slightly more unsettling. Sometimes they buried them while life was still going on. The topography of early Seattle was unstable, low, and prone to flooding. Plumbing suffered. Tides interfered with toilets. Streets turned unreliable. Then, in June 1889, the Great Seattle Fire destroyed much of the downtown district. The fire should have been the end of one city. Instead, it became permission to build another. City officials resolved to raise the grades in some places by more than 10 feet. But business could not simply stop while the streets were transformed. So merchants rebuilt in brick and, anticipating the new elevation, added second entrances to what had once been their upper floors. For a time, the city existed in two awkward planes at once. People climbed ladders to shop. They descended steps into stores that were still functioning beneath the level of the street being constructed around them. Later, when the new sidewalks were completed, hollow spaces remained between the old and the new. What survives today as the Seattle Underground is not an ancient ruin. It is a modern city's discarded first draft. That detail changes the mood of the whole story. Because now we are no longer dealing only with engineering. We are dealing with urban amnesia. The city did not merely overcome its earlier mistakes. It incorporated them, sealed them, and taught later generations to forget how contingent the process had been. The buried storefront became an attraction. The crisis that produced it became a joke on tours. The violence of transformation softened into local color. But beneath the folklore is a harder truth. The city level you walk on is often the result of political decisions about which past deserves to remain visible. This is where the maps become especially interesting. Maps do not just record streets. They legitimize them. They stabilize an argument. Once a new grade is surveyed, named, and printed, the old one begins to disappear. Not physically at first, but administratively. The old threshold becomes an eccentricity. The old alley becomes a basement corridor. The old sidewalk becomes a void. If later generations consult only official maps, they inherit the finished story rather than the contested one. That is why historic fire insurance maps, cadastral plans, and engineering surveys are so revealing. They catch the city mid-sentence. They show a stair marked where a flat sidewalk exists today. They note building footprints that later widening erased. They preserve addresses that no longer align with visible entrances. In that sense, maps are not just evidence. They are witnesses whose testimony changes over time. Paris demonstrates how powerful that change can be when the state itself takes control of urban form. By the early 19th century, central Paris was crowded, unhealthy, and politically combustible. Cholera moved through districts where waste and people were packed together. The narrow medieval streets did not simply inconvenience traffic. They sheltered barricades. During the upheavals of 1848, furniture, stones, and overturned carriages could turn tight streets into defensive lines. When Napoleon III placed Georges-Eugène Haussmann in charge of transforming the city in 1853, the project was always more than beautification. It was sanitary, imperial, logistical, and quietly military. Wide boulevards were cut through older neighborhoods. Buildings were demolished. Uniform facades rose where irregular medieval fronts had stood. Maps published before, during, and after the renovation reveal a city being forced into legibility. New axes replaced old entanglements. Streets became broader, straighter, easier to traverse, easier to patrol, harder to barricade. And here again old buildings and old maps begin to diverge. Not because one is false, but because they belong to different regimes of urban truth. Pre-Haussmann, Paris survives in fragments in courtyards, in misaligned passages, in property lines, in churches that now seem oddly placed against later boulevards. The map after renovation is cleaner, but clean maps often indicate that something messy has been removed. A city can be modernized on paper faster than it can be emotionally absorbed by the people forced to live in it. That emotional lag is easy to miss in official histories, so let us slow down and imagine one human scale within all this. A shopkeeper in Seattle, standing in 1890 behind a brick counter rebuilt after the fire, looking out at workers constructing a new street level where open sky used to be. A woman in Sacramento lifting her skirts to cross a temporary plankway above what had been the front room of a neighbor's business. A child in Chicago learning to use a doorway that had become, in the span of a few years, a basement entrance. These are not romantic images. They are disorienting ones. Because what is a city if not a set of remembered relationships between body and ground? Up one step, down three. Turn at the pump, enter at the corner door. Wait where the street dips. Every inhabitant carries that map within them. Raise the grade, erase the alley, widen the boulevard, and you do more than improve circulation. You interrupt memory at ankle height. This is why old buildings can feel strangely accusatory. They remember the older choreography. Their windows were not designed to stare into asphalt. Their lintels were not meant to crouch onto sidewalks. Their proportions still belong to a vanished public surface. And when we see that, even dimly, we feel the mismatch before we understand it. Sometimes the ground was not just raised. Sometimes the shoreline moved as well. San Francisco, in the years after the gold rush, expanded over filled waterfront. Ships abandoned in the rush for fortune were consumed by the city that grew around them. Land was made where water had been, and streets later crossed over vessels buried beneath commercial blocks. Here the mismatch between map and building becomes even stranger, because the map itself eventually naturalizes reclaimed ground. What had once been harbor becomes real estate. What had once floated becomes foundation. This is one of the recurring themes beneath our feet. Urban certainty is usually built on former uncertainty that has been compressed, paved, and forgotten. So why does the subject generate so much unease today? Partly because the visible traces are so intimate. A sunken doorway is not an abstract statistic. It is a wrongness you can stand beside. Partly because the explanation challenges the quiet fiction that cities evolve smoothly. They do not. They leap. They improvise. They bury evidence of their own desperation. And partly because maps enjoy an authority that buildings can quietly undermine. We trust the diagram. We treat the structure as anecdote. But sometimes the wall is telling the truth more stubbornly than the plan. There's also a deeper tension here, one that official accounts rarely emphasize. Street level is not purely technical. It is social power expressed in earth and stone. To set a grade is to decide whose doorway matters, whose property must adapt, which districts are worth saving, which routes deserve widening, which histories can be sacrificed in the name of health, order, or commerce. In Chicago, it was sanitation and growth. In Sacramento, flood defense. In Seattle, rebuilding and drainage. In Paris, public health entwined with state control. Different cities, different crises. Same underlying principle. When authorities redraw the ground, they redraw citizenship. That may be why the mystery lingers even after the practical explanation is known. Yes, streets were raised for sewers, for floods, for fire, for traffic, for modernity. But once you accept that, a second question opens. Why are we so rarely taught to notice the evidence? Why do guidebooks mention architecture while ignoring grade? Why do we admire facades without asking what happened to the lower third of them? Why do maps present the city as a surface when so many of its decisive changes happened vertically? Perhaps because buried street levels disturb the story cities like to tell about themselves. They suggest that progress was not always elegant. It was often invasive, improvised, and unequal. It required turning yesterday's ground floor into tomorrow's basement and then calling that normal. Yet the old level never entirely disappears. It survives in bricked-in arches, in sidewalk glass that looks down into Seattle's hollow spaces, in Sacramento courtyards where the former grade is still legible, in Chicago buildings whose first floors now seem implausibly low, in Paris, where older alignments still haunt the cleaner geometry of the boulevard, in the language of surveyors, in the marks left on masonry, in the unease of a staircase that descends beneath the city you thought you knew. That is the haunting part, not that cities changed, but that the change remains visible if you know where to look. So the next time an old building seems not to fit the street in front of it, resist the easy explanation. Look at the sill height. Look for sealed windows, buried columns, interrupted symmetry, doors that seem to belong to another century's pavement. Then imagine the map before the map, the one carried in mud, floodwater, scaffolding, ash, and argument, the one the official version replaced. Because beneath many modern streets lies not a lost civilization, but something more intimate than that. A previous agreement about where the city began, and once you start seeing that buried line, it becomes difficult to stop. Every lowered threshold begins to feel like a witness. Every mismatch becomes a clue. Every map becomes a little less final. If history lives anywhere, it may live there in the few feet between the level we walk on and the level a city was forced to leave behind. So walk slowly in old districts. Pay attention to the doors that do not make sense. The city may be telling you in the quiet language of stone and grade exactly what it had to bury in order to become what it is.